your source for everything paranormal. Para X. The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
Welcome to Stirring the Cauldron on the Para X Radio Network. And now, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
Hey, merry meet everybody, and welcome to Stirring the Cauldron. You know, according to the song Fly Like an Eagle by the Steve Miller Band, time keeps on slipping into the future. But my guest tonight, author Von Braschler, says that time also shifts back to the past as well. Now, Von is an award-winning journalist and former faculty member at the Omega Institute and has led workshops throughout the United States and the United Kingdom. A lifetime member of the Theosophical Society, he's the author of several books, including 7 Secrets of Time Travel. And tonight we're going to be exploring his latest book, Time Shifts, Experiences of Slipping into the Past and the Future. Now, as always, those of you in the chat room can slip us some questions and comments throughout the show if you like. And if you're listening live tonight, not in the chat room, you can find us at paraxradionetwork.com. So, Von, I am so glad you're here, and you wrote another really, really interesting book, and I'm happy to talk about it tonight.
Well, hi, Marla. Good to be with you. Merry meet.
Yes, thank you. Merry meet. You know, I learned a whole bunch of things by reading your book, things that made me really think, which is good for you. A little difficult for me sometimes, but it was really interesting because, I've never had, to my knowledge, any personal time slip experiences, but I do know people who have. And contrary to what some people think, these are not rare occurrences, are they?
No, that's why I wrote the book. That, and when I wrote the earlier books on time travel, I would get on shows such as yours, Marla, and people would often want to talk about their time slips. I realized they were really pretty common in a sense, but most people would have no way of relating to it. They'd say it was a delusional, or it was a vision, or it was a daydream, or something in their imagination. Because it's not in our frame of reference, it's not culturally accepted, people say, well, I must have been mistaken.
At the very least. This is what the book is all about. And you're talking about people's accounts from those who have had experiences, including your own, and partly to maybe establish a pattern of how they occur or why they occur. And maybe they're not completely explainable in a sense, but when did you experience your first time slip, and where'd you slip to?
Well, I've had a number of them, and they just, when we call them slips, we mean that they're not planned, right? They're accidental.
Right.
And literally, you take one step, and there you are in somewhere else. The somewhere else can be some other time. It can be some other place. In my case, it was some other time and some other place, and I never returned. I'm always going to be like several hours in the future. So when I was like 11 years old, or 12, can't remember when, I boarded a berry bus to go pick berries with a group of friends. I always wondered what those big yellow school buses were, because I always walked to school. I like to walk. So anyway, I jumped on board the bus, and they said, berry bus. I said, well, what is it? They said, well, we'd go pick berries, and they have a river you can swim. So, of course, I just went and ate as many berries as I could, and I went swimming all day long. I was a terrible employee. But I got sick one day, and I decided I had to go home. I mean, there's something about a person when they get very, very sick. It's like the spirit within you. It says, I've got to get out of here. This is really bad. You seem to know deep down. So in this case, I said, I've got to go home. They wouldn't take me home. They said, wait for the bus at the end of the day. So I looked back at the road we'd driven across to get there, and I realized that every day they passed a railroad crossing to get there. And I thought, well, if I'll just get on that railroad track, and we must have been 20 miles out of town, and I just started walking. And I told my friends, if I stay on this railroad track, I'll go to my house. And they said, that's impossible. I said, what do you mean? It stops right in front of my house. Well, I didn't know exactly where my house was or how far it was. I knew it was a long ways. I didn't know the way. I didn't know the switchbacks. I didn't know if that was the right railroad track or not. I just started walking, and when I got around the corner and I could no longer see my friends, I took one step forward, and boom, I was in front of my house. And yeah, and it's like I remember I stepped off the track, walked in the front door, flopped on my mother's bed, and yelled, "I'm really sick. My appendix had burst." Oh. And I indeed couldn't have waited any longer. Well, it wasn't. I didn't talk about how I got there. I just said I came home. That's all I said, you know. And so none of my friends wanted to talk about it because it was so weird. How'd you get home? I said, well, I was instantly home. I followed the railroad tracks. They said, that's ridiculous. Well, a year later, I'm in the backyard. I'm looking out at the front yard, and I have to realize, finally, I have to admit that it was paranormal, because the railroad tracks did not stop in front of my house. Nowhere near. Never did, never have. We lived in the middle of town. The tracks, there were train tracks, which did not lead apparently to the berry field, but on the far side in either direction, but nowhere near us. But a couple of years later, we moved north of town, and in fact, the railroad tracks stopped right in front of our home. So I always thought that was an odd thing. And then I've actually had events after that continued, and then I've had people kind of pop in and out that I thought were definitely time travelers, that I would say I observed them passing through. Wow. And then you know, I've written a couple. I've written at least one book on a ghost, and I have to admit, as a former ghost hunter, that I think now that what we often see as ghosts or beings from another realm, let's say, are probably just time travelers.
I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does make sense. But and maybe it's kind of like the thing, you know, like not everybody can see a ghost, and maybe not everybody can see a time traveler either. Maybe it takes a certain sensibility to be able to do that. I don't know.
Sensibility. What I noticed in interviewing people and observing stories, classical stories, and thinking about my own accounts, there would be like a moment where a person would get very still within themselves, and they would have like a consciousness shift where, you know, they weren't thinking, you know, they weren't humming a tune, you know, they were just blank. And then there would be like a consciousness shift, and then boom, you know, something would happen, you know. And when you perceive a time traveler, or you in fact travel yourself in time, it seems that it's often under these conditions. It'll be like, it'll be in the late in the day, afternoon, or early dusk. It will be maybe in the late summer or early fall. It will be at a time when you're very quiet, perhaps even alone, and you'll have gone through some kind of a consciousness shift where you're just no longer worrying about yesterday and planning tomorrow. Your mind's blank, and boom, there you are.
It's, the whole concept is really fascinating. But okay, so you kept having these experiences. Did you just all of a sudden decide to research the subject, or just take it in stride? Did the curiosity come eventually, or is it still a curiosity?
Well, yeah, I think it's all of the above. So I when I lived in Oregon, I worked on a newspaper in Oregon, and I lived on Mount Hood, a lovely mountain, and I had a lot of these kind of strange encounters. But how I got to Oregon is an awfully strange story that involves time travel. I was looking outside my house one day to find my newspaper, my morning newspaper. And in place of it, for the first and only time I can recall, was not the paper but a book. And the cover of the book had been removed, and I picked it up, which is a sure way to get you to thumb through the book because you can't see what's on the cover. And it was a book by a psychic minister from New Zealand called Jeffrey Hodson, and he was writing about, I would say, consciousness, Raja Yoga. He was writing about altered states of consciousness. He was an incredible person. This book was called A Call to the Heights, and it really amazed me too, because he had in that book these magical correspondences that I thought were just fascinating. I just spent hours thinking about all that, and I would say, what's your favorite note? What's your favorite color? And then I'd say, oh, you're a Libra, So it often works, And anyway, so I realized that it was published by this funny group called the Theosophical Society, and I'd never heard of them. I thought, are they like crime fighters, or what are they? Theosophical Society, So I couldn't find anything about them, and I found they had a campsite in the San Juan Islands, where I've since moved, and that's all I knew. And then, so I had a job after the newspaper where I would travel from Portland, Oregon, to New York and other points in the East to set up either a newspaper column that we originated called Dream House of Tomorrow, or I would try to set up these joint publications, which would be a magazine that would come out once a year with somebody else's name on it, and we would supply the copy. And so I'm on one of these trips, and typically these trips would stop for a few minutes to take on additional passengers in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, I'd never actually been there. I just, the plane would stop there for a few minutes. And so on one of these flights, we're just in the air, leaving Portland, and a flight attendant walked up to me. And I remember she was wearing a great big amethyst crystal, and she walked up to me and she said, "Von Braschler." I said, "Yes." She said, I need to move you. Is that all right? I said, "Sure." She pushed me in the back row, way in the back row, kind of where they sit, And then she comes back later and she says, "I've reviewed your food choice." This is when they gave you meals, right? Mm-hmm. And she said, "I'm going to change your diet to a fruit platter. I think you'll learn to like it." I said, "Okay." And I'm thinking, do I get grapes or do I get watermelon? This could be interesting. So she comes back later and she says, "May I sit with you? I would like to speak with you." I said, "Okay, now we're going to get to it." And I'm thinking, this gal is cute. She has no interest in me. Well, what is it? What is she trying to sell me? What's the deal? So she sits down and she says, "Now, when you get to Minneapolis, I want you to contact me and we'll start your yoga training. I'm going to teach you all levels of higher consciousness." And I said, "Oh, there's some mistake. I have no plans to go to Minneapolis. This plane stops briefly, takes on other passengers. I don't get off in Minneapolis. I continue on to New York." She said, "Well, okay, but when you get to Minneapolis, you contact me. This is important." And I started to say again, no, I have no plans of ever going to Minneapolis, which I thought of as a terrible place with ice and snow, right? Mm-hmm. So she gives me a card. On the front it says, Carol in her last name, and it says flight attendant, the name of the airlines. And she just turned it over, and it says Colleen in her last name, and then it says yoga instructor and her phone number. She said, call that number when you get to Minneapolis. I said, sure, but it's not likely it'll ever happen. She says, don't lose the card. So I get back, and just a few weeks later, we show up Monday morning at work in Portland, and one of the co-owners of the company flies in from Detroit. And he said, this is kind of sudden, I know, but I met with my partner over this last weekend. We think we should move the whole company to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And my mouth just opens up, and he says, is that a problem? And I said, well, Minneapolis, Minnesota? He said, yes. He said, we have a consultant that's going to work with us there, and he's a magazine executive in the area, and it would be very, very good for us to work with him. And everyone who moves will have a good job. I think the company's on good footing when we move. But if you stay behind, I have to tell you that you'll be phased out. So I get there in the middle of a blizzard. It's like Halloween morning, the day before Halloween, the morning of Halloween, and we get like 30 inches of snow, and I'm trying to unload my stuff in my apartment, and I'm sitting down and I'm thinking, So I look at my wallet and I have her card and I call. I said, Carol, Colleen. She said, Vaughn, it's you. You made it. I said, yes. He says, good, now we can begin. Now, she said, we have to decide, do you want individual instruction or group instruction? I said, well, how do you organize it? She says, no, you tell me what you need. Then she says, now, you decide whether you want to have weekend classes or evening classes. And I said, well, how much are these going to cost me? She said, well, now you could pay me whatever you want or nothing at all. It really doesn't matter. So I start the classes, and they're incredible. She's incredible. I mean, she knows everything. She's so good. I mean, she takes me to places that are just unimaginable. Pretty soon we're doing home parties demonstrating some of these things, which are truly amazing. And so then she takes me to a meeting, and there's like 75 people in a room, and they're all fighting over a movie they've just watched. And it's a group called the Theosophical Society. She said, Vaughn, this is your group. I want you to stay with them and work with them. And I'm going to be leaving you now. I'm going to be moving to Oklahoma and start a yoga retreat center there. Now, I have to tell you that I never, in all this time she gave me the training, ever saw this woman go to the airport. So it's been kind of an interesting thing. I would say she was a time traveler. How else in the world did she know I was going to be moving 3 weeks before the owner even got the idea?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing. And something else was amazing when I was reading the book, that you mentioned that some people have had those experiences without even knowing it. Now, how does that happen? I mean, is that commonplace?
Yeah, it happens because, people will be so disoriented. It's outside of our normal frame of reference.
Right.
It's not acceptable to talk about it, so people, don't want to talk about it. Like I never wanted to talk about any of my experiences. And then you finally run into people that have had other odd things. Typically, people will report being very disoriented, and they might not have a clear recollection of what they saw or thought they saw, but they know that there was a gap in time they can't account for when they were somewhere else, let's say, somewhere else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because, and some people are fine. I mean, a friend of mine was staying at a B&B bed and breakfast in Gettysburg. And she was just sitting there minding her own business, and she kind of blinked, and all of a sudden she was in an operating room, a Civil War operating room, where they were doing surgery on some poor man, because back then, knock him out with, something in the head, but that, painful. then she popped back. And I mean, she understood that, something paranormal happened and it was okay. She didn't freak out or anything. But it certainly wasn't her choice to happen. I mean, she just kind of went and came back. And so, yeah.
It's very unsettling for a lot of people, and they are reluctant to talk about it. They'll often, like my mother, she talked about seeing a strange man walk across the field one day when she was a girl, and he just disappeared, and she couldn't figure out who he was. And then later on, the same thing repeated itself later in life when she returned for a funeral. And she returned for a funeral, and it turned out to be her brother, the way he looked just before he died. Not the way she saw him as a young girl, because she was even older than he was. But there's what is amazing is that there's almost it's not a scary thing like spirits popping in and out. It's more like you've slipped on the timeline. I think of like the timeline is like a conveyor belt, and goes around and around and around, and we just happen to be standing right here. We're focused on here, this place and this time. But if you take a step and you allow yourself to be moving in the conveyor belt, you're somewhere else. So we're only focused in terms of our perception on one place and time, and that we call now. But in fact, there are many nows operating simultaneously. Going back to when I lived in Mount Hood, I mean, I lived right halfway up the mountain on one of the old wagon trails. This one was called the Barlow Trail. And it was once said that it took days off by lowering wagons over a cliff and into the river. It was a bit dangerous, but that's where we were. And the old Barlow Trail actually traveled on a road near my house. And I wasn't the only one, it turns out, among my neighbors who would look out there at dusk on a late summer day and see old settlers, in bedraggled clothes, looking gaunt and thirsty and tired as could be, leaning against their Conestoga wagons, and then poof, they're gone. So I think that sometimes our timelines converge. We shouldn't say timelines. There's only one timeline, but it's like our points on the timeline converge.
Yeah, there's a story when I was writing one of my Ghosts of Hollywood books, that a few blocks from my house, people would see in broad daylight cowboys and Indians fighting, or settlers and Indians, or white men and Native Americans fighting. And there was actually battles going on there, and they would pop in and pop out, and it was kind of commonplace.
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of people have talked about the Marfa Lights in Texas, and they would see these kind of encounters repeated, and it would often be at dusk, as I recall. There seems to be a certain time when the conditions are right, and I think there's probably also a little bit of earth magic involved here. By that I mean, I don't know if there's black holes or singularities involved. We think of that as being out there in outer space, but there could be energy vortexes, there could be meridian grids, there could be portals, in the earth. And I think that there are certain energetically charged or magnetically charged places in the earth where things go wonky. Like, let's look at not just the Marfa Lights, but let's look at Bermuda Triangle. I mean, there are certain places where these reports happen more often.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of people believe that time shifts might be dangerous, just as like those people that think that if you're doing astral projection, you're going to lose your soul forever and you'll never come back in your body. But in your book, you offer exercises to prepare those who want to personally explore and experience time shifts on a controlled basis. What are some of the pros and cons of doing that? And are there right or wrong reasons for wanting to try?
Well, yeah, I think there's certainly good reasons to try. and it's not to change the past or change the future. It is to learn from the past and be advised of what lies ahead. Because our life is a long journey of evolution and growth. And we need to understand, how we started on this trip, and what our goals originally were when we started, because we forget, and then where we're going, where we're headed. So we're just not walking around in circles, but actually making some progress. So what I did was I came up with some exercises that I could think of, like groups of people that historically have been very good at time shifting, and that would be like shamans, like we're talking about, like dreamwalkers, shapeshifters, skinwalkers, like that. And they go into a deep trance, and they seem to experience not ordinary reality in outside normal space and time. And then I think of yoga masters, like in the Samadhi mystic tradition, where they study higher consciousness, Raja Yoga. They train their young people to first of all control their dreams, so they have lucid dreams and leave their body in dreams, but not just like an astral voyage, astral travel, but taking all of themselves except for their physical body. There are very few cases, but some of time travelers, time shifters who actually physically relocated in another place. I think I did. I think I'm 6 hours in the future, and I'll never get those back. But that's okay, I mean, some people have actually walked into but most people, when they walk into the future or into the past, even briefly, accidentally or on purpose, they're an odd duck out of water, in that they don't seem to be seen by people. They might see people, and people might be aware of them, but only vaguely, like they have, let's say, an etheric body or an energy body. Not a truly physical body, but one that resembles their physical body. They will notice that there's not a lot of motion. They might not hear sounds. So what we're aware of is that when we travel outside the physical body, we don't have our 5 physical senses. We have a new set of awareness. Like the cowboy poet from the Midwest, Bruce Vance, said in Mindscape and Dreamscape, in outside, and when we voyage like this, like in a lucid dream or a time shift, you are experiencing the world with new eyes and new ears. So you don't hear things the same way or see things the same way. But often people will look frozen. They won't move. There's some interesting stories like that. And sometimes people will interact, but most people will not. Most people will not see you.
And then there are people that have had their pictures taken and stuff, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the camera can catch it sometimes, and the naked eye can catch it sometimes, and other times maybe it's like working magic. You have to believe it before you see it.
Exactly. And you say, well, is it real? Well, it's part of your moving reality if you're reacting to it. And so it's there. It's a matter of will you accept it? Do you actually perceive it? Because, perception and awareness are 2 very different things.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And we're going to go to a break in a minute, but I think I'm going to ask you the question now, and then you can pick it up when we get back. But I was looking through the exercises that we can do to go here and there, back and forth, by visualizing where we want to go or who we want to find. Yeah. But we can also visit, according to you, ourselves in a previous life. And that kind of made me stop and think, because in general, we've had maybe more than one previous life, and we don't remember them when we're here for the most part. So I was sitting here scratching my head for a minute, trying to figure out how we can go back into our previous lives. So in the meantime, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll be talking about some more time slip stories, and also about, a little more on how we can experience them themselves. So, guys, don't slip away during the break. We'll be right back.
Stirring the Cauldron will be right back, so don't go away. If you end up with webbed feet, remember, you've been warned.
Hey everyone, it's Marla. If you like tonight's episode of Stirring the Cauldron and the archive podcast as well, take a look at the show's YouTube channel and check out the dozens of shows that are there just waiting to be heard. New shows are added each week, and while you're there, why not subscribe? It's free. And if you click on that tiny little bell icon at the top of the page, you'll be notified when new shows are available. Just go to youtube.com and then type in Stirring the Cauldron Para X and the link will appear. Just like magic.
For almost 2 decades, Midnight Syndicate has composed the soundtrack to your darkest nightmares. The imaginations of fans worldwide have been fueled by its gothic, horror, and fantasy symphonic albums. A staple of the haunted house and amusement park industry, for many, the music of Midnight Syndicate is the music of Halloween. Now, Midnight Syndicate will bring your nightmares to life in a spectacle of sound from beyond the grave.
Welcome back to Stirring the Cauldron. Once again, here's your host, Marla Brooks.
We're back with my guest, Von Braschler, and we're exploring his new book, Time Shifts, Experiences of Slipping into the Past and Future. And I posed a question right before the break. Past and future is okay. We may know where we're going, how we're getting there, but how do we get back to a previous life that we know nothing about?
Well, I'm going to do a forward pass to a fella I used to work with. The author Michael Newton, Dr. Michael Newton, wrote 3 amazing books. When I worked at Llewellyn Publications, we had this retired psychologist named Dr. Michael Newton. He came in and he said, I've retired, and going over my notes, there are some odd cases that seem to show a pattern, and so I've written a manuscript. Tell me what you think about it. And it was Journey of Souls. And now, like a psychologist, he often would put people reclining on their back on a sofa, right? Mm-hmm. And he would kind of regress them, right? And he put them then into an altered state, right? And he'd say, okay, go back as far as you can. Okay, now the psychologist would normally expect them to talk about when they're a child, right? Mm-hmm. But he was surprised that he had a whole series of people, and it turned out that they were somehow linked like a group soul throughout all eternity. They didn't necessarily even know each other, but they were like the same pod group or something. He called them a group souls. And he said that they went farther back than that into previous lives, and they would talk about previous lives, and they would talk about life between lives, what it was like to be a light body, and then go through like a recapitulation period, and then meet with your group leaders and your other group souls, and then you would reincarnate, and you would try it again, and hope that you had some recall and progress from your earlier lifetime. So he had a number of these people. So then he wrote Destiny of Souls, and then a third book, and he was so busier than he'd ever been, because people wanted to talk about these previous lives. Well, they were documented. So when we brought him in, we said, now, this is really fantastic, but can you document that? He brought case files with him,
Mm.
He wouldn't give us people's full names, confidentiality. But he had case files,